What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The topic of this episode is deriving exploits. We're going to discuss the two main methodologies employed to derive exploitative strategies in poker. We're also going to highlight the limit of general understanding of this topic. And we'll see that there are some errors with the way that high-level players approach deriving exploits in general. This is going to be a fairly complex topic. We'll try and keep things as simple as possible as we go through. So we mentioned that there are two methodologies currently employed for deriving exploitative strategies. We'll refer to the first as vacuumed EV analysis, and we'll refer to the second as GTO analysis. Both of these methodologies employ data on villain. So we're either going to need opponent stats to generate the exploits from to begin with, or we're going to need some type of pool data. So that's a large collection of hands in a database stored on a player pool that allows us to extract the general tendencies of that player pool and hence use that information to formulate exploits. So we'll take these one at a time. The first is vacuumed EV analysis. This is the type of analysis I've historically relied on the most heavily, and it's subtly different from the way that most training sites and most high-level players approach derivation of exploitative strategies. Vacuumed EV analysis is actually very straightforward and relies on primitive poker calculations. Now, what we mean by that is calculations that determine whether a bet is generating automatic profit. So is our opponent folding above a break-even threshold? But also the calculation where we look to see how often our opponent is bluffing and whether we have a pot odds call against that with all of our bluff catches. There's nothing overly complicated here. We don't need to make use of any GTO calculations. Simple example, if we are making a half pot bet and our opponent folds more than 33% of the time, we can bluff profitably with any two cards. There's no GTO analysis there, just a very primitive calculation that indicates that our opponent is probably folding too much. And even if it doesn't prove categorically that he's folding too much, it does prove that we can generate profit by bluffing in that situation. So the way vacuumed EV analysis works is we have a look at the pool data, could be a river situation, for example. Are our opponents folding above the automatic profit threshold in a specific river situation? If the answer is yes, they're exploitable and we may be able to fire any two cards as a bluff. If the answer is no, then we can exploit them by not bluffing. Is our opponent bluffing more than they should in terms of the correct bluff to value ratio to have on a certain river? We can exploit them by calling all of our bluff catches. Is our opponent under bluffing relative to how much they should be bluffing? We can exploit by folding all of our bluff catches. Very straightforward, simple methodology without any intensive calculation required. So that's methodology number one, which we'll refer to as vacuumed EV analysis. Now let's get on to the more mainstream technique used to derive exploitative strategies, which we'll refer to as GTO analysis. So the idea here is rather than compare pool data to primitive values, such as pot odds or automatic profit thresholds, we compare pool data to approximated GTO values. So we can ask a solver, how often is our opponent supposed to be folding in a specific situation? If they're folding more often than GTO suggests, then we can exploit our opponent by playing aggressively. If our opponent is folding less than they should, we might be able to exploit them by employing the opposite strategy, perhaps playing more passively and having a more value-oriented range. One of the interesting problems that's common to both methodologies is that it's very easy to exploit a player who is folding too much, but it's a lot more complex to derive the correct continuing ranges against opponents who are not folding enough. And that's usually because when our opponent folds, the game tree ends on the current street, whereas when our opponent continues too much, we have to think about all of the possible actions that can occur on the later streets in order to make an estimate of the EV. Part of the GTO analysis approach will often then involve a second step where the solve is rerun with villain strategy being node locked. What we mean by that is, let's imagine a player is folding too much on the flop. We've checked the pool data. Let's just say the pool data says our opponent should be folding 35% of the time in a given scenario, and they are actually folding 40% of the time. It's then possible to rerun the solve, but force our opponent to fold 40% of the time, and then see how our strategy should adjust as a result. Now, it might seem like the end result is going to be a good exploitative strategy given to us by the solver, but unfortunately it's not quite that simple, as we'll discuss a bit later in this podcast episode. So far, in summary, we have two different methodologies for deriving exploitative strategies. We have vacuumed EV analysis, which involves comparing pool data to primitive calculations, and we have GTO analysis that involves comparing pool data to solver aggregated data. Let's think about an example, and it's here we'll begin to highlight some of the limitations in general understanding. Now, there are answers to these limitations, but we're going to focus on the limitations themselves and to some extent tear apart some of the existing ideas regarding how to derive exploitative strategies. Let's take a simple example. We have fold to c-bet. Now, if we take a solver and we put it in the situation where it's a button versus big blind situation, single raised heads up pot after the button open raises, and the button fires a 1/3 pot continuation bet. It's possible to create an aggregate of the big blind folding frequencies across every single flop texture. And if we do that, and it will depend partly on the solver tree, but most solvers are going to advise that the big blind should be folding about 33% of the time against a 1/3 pot size bet. Now, that's an interesting value from a primitive EV calculation point of view, because if we think about the break-even threshold of a 1/3 pot c-bet, well, the break-even threshold is actually 25%. In other words, any time our opponent is folding more than 25% of the time, we can generate automatic profit by firing any two cards. But despite this, the solver says that the out of position player should be folding 33% of the time, which confers guaranteed automatic profit to the c-better in this case. Now, part of the reason for this is that the out of position player is going to have an equity realization disadvantage. In other words, if he tried to defend at a frequency which would prevent the button from generating automatic profit, then he would be defending some hands which are actually minus EV to continue with. In other words, the big blind is in a disadvantageous situation such that he cannot prevent the in-position player from generating automatic profit. Now, here's the really interesting question, which I think in many cases is going to expose a player or group of players' limit of understanding on this topic. The solver says if a player folds more than 33% of the time, they are exploitable and are folding too much. Primitive EV calculation says if a player folds more than 25% of the time, they're exploitable because the in-position player can generate automatic profit. So now here's the interesting question. What happens if the opponent folds 30% of the time? So he's folding less often than the solver said he should, but he's folding more often than the automatic profit threshold. Against that opponent, are we exploiting our opponent by betting air? You might want to take a moment for that question to resonate. I don't think it's a straightforward question to answer, and I think in most cases it's going to highlight a limitation in the way that this topic is taught. Now, the simple answer to this question is yes, we're still exploiting our opponent because he's falling above the automatic profit threshold. However, there are a couple of caveats here. Firstly, if we did fire all of our air just because our opponent is falling above the automatic profit threshold, that's something that he could potentially counter-exploit. So against a very good opponent, we could end up being the ones who are being exploited. The other caveat here is just because a line is plus EV doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest EV line. So there's a fairly good chance in this situation, if our opponent is folding 30% of the time, although we can technically fire a zero equity holding as a bluff and it would still technically be profitable, it's probably not the best line in many cases. It's usually going to be a higher EV option to check back and play that part of the game tree instead. Now let's think about another very similar example, but it's going to be slightly different. So it's going to be another fold to c-bet scenario. This time the aggressor is going to be out of position, and it's a small blind versus big blind cold call, single raised heads up pot. And just imagine for a minute that the board texture is a specific texture this time, rather than aggregated data, and the board texture is 954 rainbow. Now, according to the solver, big blind is supposed to fold 25.8% of the time against a half pot bet. The break-even point on a half pot bluff is 33%. In other words, this scenario is the converse of the previous scenario. In the previous example, the defender was folding above the automatic profit threshold. In this example, because the position of the big blind is advantageous this time, the big blind is actually folding less than the automatic profit threshold. So we can ask a fairly similar question here. The solver says, if big blind folds more than 25.8% of the time, he's exploitable. Whereas a primitive calculation suggests that our opponent is only exploitable by firing air if he folds more than 33% of the time against a zero equity bluff. So now imagine the scenario that our opponent is folding exactly 30% of the time. So according to the solver, he's folding too much, but according to the primitive break-even threshold calculation, he's not folding enough. Are we still exploiting our opponent in that scenario if we fire air? It might seem at first glance like the answer is going to be the same as the previous question, but this is slightly different. The answer now is, it depends. And this starts to highlight one of the problems with GTO style analysis, where we compare a GTO data point to a pool data point. Yes, technically, our opponent is making a mistake and he's vulnerable to being bluffed here because he's only supposed to fold 25.8% of the time and he's folding 30% of the time. But here's the problem. We can't assume that our opponent is definitely exploitable because we're already assuming that he's reached the flop with a perfect GTO range. So this is his folding frequency, assuming a perfect GTO range. So we first of all need to know why our opponent is folding more often than the solver suggests. Is it because he's not playing very well on the flop with his perfect GTO range? Or is it because he never had a GTO range to begin with? Perhaps he reached the flop with a range that's too wide, and this is actually a fairly good folding frequency for the type of range that he reached the flop with. So the key issue here is, when a player or a player pool appears to be folding more frequently than a suggested GTO value, although it often indicates there's an exploitative opportunity, it doesn't guarantee there's an exploitative opportunity, because there are assumptions that are being made here. We're assuming in this case that our opponent has reached the flop with a perfect GTO range, and realistically, he probably hasn't. So there is essentially a huge issue just going around comparing various aggregated GTO data points to pool data points, because the solver is making assumptions which are not representative of what the pool is actually doing. I would hazard a guess that this is already fairly complicated, so we won't add too much additional information here, but we will talk briefly about the pros and cons of both of these exploitative derivation methodologies. So let's think about the primitive or vacuumed EV analysis. One of the reasons why I've had good success with this type of analysis is that it's very straightforward. It doesn't require a solver. It only requires a basic understanding of break-even thresholds and bluff to value ratios / pot odds. So there's obviously a bit of a barrier for entry if you tell your student that before they can actually begin to derive exploitative strategies, they need to spend money on a solver or a set of pre-solved solutions to the game. This has a very low barrier of entry because it just requires learning some basic maths. The other advantage to vacuumed exploits is that it results in guaranteed exploits, in the sense that if your opponent is falling above the automatic profit threshold, While it doesn't guarantee that bluffing is the best line, it does guarantee that bluffing is plus EV. So it does guarantee you're making money with that line. Whereas if your opponent is folding more often than the solver suggests, but lower than the automatic profit threshold, there's no guarantee that there's actually any exploit there to begin with. Of course, the downside is, if we're using the primitive EV or vacuumed EV analysis approach, is that we could miss out on some potential exploits. There could be a more subtle exploit that working with a solver would expose, because perhaps our opponent's exploitable despite the fact that he's not folding above the automatic profit threshold. So we might miss that if we're using the vacuumed EV analysis. But then again, it's probably not a very big exploit to begin with. One thing we'll find with vacuumed EV analysis is that it's very effective for river situations and it's fairly effective for turn situations. Calculating river EV is very simple because it's the end of the game tree. Calculating EV on the turn is a little bit more complex because anytime we take an action on the turn, we still have to think about all of the possible activities that could occur on the river. And it gets especially complex with the flop. It's very difficult to figure out what the EV of a certain flop line is because we have to factor in all possible decisions on the turn and river. So what we see with vacuumed EV analysis is as we go backwards in terms of streets, it gets slightly harder to use. In terms of a starting point for deriving exploitative strategies, however, I would recommend the vacuumed EV analysis, even though this is not the methodology that the vast majority of training sites, coaches, and books promote at this stage. Let's now think about the pros and cons of the GTO analysis approach. One issue here is that it's very complex to generate aggregate GTO data for every scenario. Remember, we're comparing pool data to a GTO data point. And in order to get that GTO data point, we need to run a solve or have access to solver output. And if we want aggregate or average data, it means we're going to have to run a situation for every flop. Now, solvers are quite powerful, and we can usually do that for every possible flop without too much difficulty. The problem occurs when we want to solve for every possible turn. It's fairly straightforward to solve for every possible turn given a certain flop, but to solve for every possible turn given every possible flop, we have a problem that grows exponentially. So by the time we get to the river, it's very difficult to get average data points for river scenarios. Sure, we can have every possible river given a certain flop and turn, but to have every possible river given every possible turn given every possible flop to get truly aggregate data is virtually impossible. It's just too computationally expensive to derive all of these GTO data points. Now, there are ways of working around this problem, which will be slightly outside the scope of what we're discussing today, but just keep in mind that this is very complex compared to the level of complexity of running these primitive poker calculations such as pot odds and break-even thresholds. Besides, as we've mentioned, deviations from GTO frequencies by the pool don't guarantee exploitative opportunities. In many cases, they might indicate that the pool is exploitable, but it's based on a large amount of inaccurate assumptions regarding what kind of ranges the pool is showing up with. So just like the vacuumed EV analysis, we can still miss out on potential exploits here. And on the flip side, we could be incorrectly trying to exploit our opponent in a situation where the analysis hints that they might be exploitable, but they're not actually exploitable. So we're incorrectly trying to exploit our opponent and losing money as a result. Besides, do you remember how we said that this type of analysis is often paired with a second step where a node lock is employed on a solve to generate the exploitative strategy? Well, that whole concept is flawed. And I'm going to take a moment to explain the reason why, because once again, it really highlights the fringe or the edge of the general understanding of how exploits work in poker. So let's just think of an example of how a node lock works. So we gave a simple example earlier, which is our opponent is folding more often than he should be to a continuation bet. So what we do is we force the solver to fold at that frequency. So at that specific decision node, we're not allowing the solver to do whatever it wants. We are placing a lock on that node and imposing our own strategy, or the strategy we think our opponent is going to employ. So think about this question. If we node lock villain strategy and run the solve, then the solver will tell us the correct exploit against villain strategy. Is that statement true, or is it false? Again, you might want to take a moment and think about this, maybe even pause the podcast. Many training schools and high-level players will tell you this is true, right? This is what a solver is for, right? You node lock your opponent's strategy, you rerun the solve, and now the solver tells you how to exploit your opponent, right? No, not exactly. This is mostly false. What the solver gives us is not the best exploitative response, but the best GTO response given a villain imbalance. Another way of thinking about this is that the solver is partially exploiting the opponent, but it's doing so in a way that's not open to counter exploitation. Now, that's not how max exploitative strategies work, because max exploitative strategies don't care about counter exploitation. Max exploitative strategies assume that villain's game plan is static and is not going to adjust in the face of highly unbalanced but maximally exploitative strategies. Besides, there's a couple of other very serious issues at work here. The first is the assumptions that the solver is going to be making at every other decision node on the tree won't necessarily reflect what villain is actually doing. Because although that single decision point has been node locked, the rest of the tree is going to proceed with both players making GTO correct decisions, which is probably not how villain is going to play. The other issue here is documenting villain strategy is not as simple as just employing a single node lock. Technically, as we've already mentioned, we should look to document our opponent's strategy at all of the other decision nodes. But even if we just focus on the decision node in question, understanding accurately the exact range that our opponent continues with at that decision node is going to be extremely complex and is going to require a large amount of data. So what we end up with when we're making use of node locking techniques to generate exploitative strategies is a strategy that's not maximally exploitative and is based on a wide array of false and inaccurate assumptions about villain, which just won't be true in practice. Just so you know, this is one of the most common methodologies employed by high-level training sites in the modern game, and as you can see, there are serious issues with it. Does the average player know this information? Do they know the limitations of the techniques they're using? In most cases, the answer is no. This is probably fairly new information to the majority of listeners. When we think about the GTO Plus software, which is a commonly used solver, it actually had a predecessor, which some of you will know about, but maybe the newer players won't know about. And the predecessor had the name CREV, which stood for Card Runners EV. And although GTO Plus is considered the next iteration of the software, so it's considered an upgrade from CREV, there's one feature in CREV which was left behind and not integrated into the new solver. And that was the max exploit tool. So Card Runners EV had an equilibrium solver, which does exactly the same as what a modern solver does, like GTO Plus or PO solver. But Card Runners EV also had a max exploit tool. And what that does is generate the maximum exploit while not worrying about counter exploitation. That would technically be a more relevant tool for generating maximally exploitative strategies against an opponent or against the pool. Now, in conclusion, I'd first like to say if you struggle to follow any aspect of this podcast episode, don't worry too much. This was fairly advanced and we're discussing the fringes of the average player's understanding of exploitative play. Perhaps listen to the episode a few more times to see what other information you can extract, but don't worry too much. These types of concepts will become clearer over a longer period of time rather than instant understanding of what we're discussing in this episode. Now, in conclusion, we've discussed two methodologies. Which should you be using to generate your own exploitative strategies against the pool? As we've discussed, the vacuumed approach, where we make use of the primitive calculations, is undoubtedly easier and has great results. And you can generate extremely high win rates by using this type of methodology to derive your exploitative strategy. Having said that, the objective here should not be to use one methodology over the other. We should actually probably make use of both. And one simple reason for that is the vacuumed approach is especially good for later streets. Remember how we said calculating river EVs is very straightforward because there's only one street left to play? Whereas GTO is the opposite. Remember how we said aggregating river data is an exponentially large problem, whereas aggregating flop data is really not too difficult. You can use any modern solver to generate average GTO frequencies on the flop for every single flop texture. So what we find is two different methodologies where one excels at later street play and one is especially helpful for earlier street play. Having said that, the most important exploits are on the later streets. So the most important exploits are on the river, and there are also a lot of very important exploits on the turn. This is not to say we can't exploit our opponents on the earlier streets, but the further we progress through a hand, the more important our understanding of exploitative play is going to be. And again, that really highlights the value and relevance of the vacuumed EV approach to deriving exploitative strategies. Well, that's pretty much it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. I just want to pop in real quick and thank you for listening to this entire episode, and also let you know that if you want to find even more exploits and you really want to solidify your entire strategy, both from a theoretically strong standpoint and also an exploitatively strong standpoint, I would highly suggest checking out Core if you haven't already. redchippoker.com/core to get started. It is the absolute best investment you're going to make into your poker training. Everything is extremely organized and in depth, exactly to the level you need for beginner to intermediate players that are really starting to take their game more seriously and want to fix holes in their own game as well as take advantage of holes in their opponent's games. At the time that I'm recording this, Core is only $5 a week, and again, I highly suggest it if you're trying to take poker more seriously. Whether you play a couple times a month or a ton, it's very important to make sure you have this information and knowledge, and being able to study it at your own pace and in an extremely organized fashion is going to make things much easier and at the end of the day, more powerful. Again, redchippoker.com/core, that's CORE, redchippoker.com/core to get started. Can't wait to see you in there.